Hi, I'm excited to be here. I've been planning for this for 6 months since they asked me, so thank you for inviting me. Before I jump into talking about evolution, what I'd really like to do is just start with a very quick and a very short prayer. Because speaking about evolution to an audience of people who don't know me is always a little scary, and especially when it's an audience of Christians. So if you just close your eyes for a second. Heavenly Father, Abba, please just descend upon us at this moment and provide a sense of peace as we embark on a difficult topic that makes people uncomfortable sometimes. And Lord, we just invite you in. Help me to say the things that help people to understand this in a way that's non-threatening and that builds you up. Thank you, Jesus. In your name. Amen. All right, let's dive into this. I was asked to speak about 2 topics tonight: the evidence for evolution, and then my experiences teaching evolution to Christian college students. So we should be done by about April 14th. No, I'm just going to touch upon those things a little bit. Whenever I speak about evolution, I like to let the audience know a little bit about me. I am a fully devoted Christ follower. I have one foot in the evolution pathway, but the word makes me very nervous in these last couple of years. So I hesitate to say I'm an evangelical, but I fully embrace biological evolution as the mechanism with which God created the diversity on earth. And I consider it my vocation to help change this conflict narrative that scientific evolution and Christian faith are not compatible. And in trying to help others navigate the evolution and faith terrain, I find that many people hold significant misunderstandings about what evolution is. So in its most, maybe this way? Turn it around. It's plugged in, we're turned around. Thank you, though. We're good to go. In its most simplistic form, evolution is a well-tested, well-confirmed explanation for the incredible biological diversity of life on Earth. It describes the mechanisms that explain the changes that we see over time, and it leads us to conclude that very diverse living organisms descended and diversified from earlier forms during the history of Earth. Notice it's neutral about God. It doesn't say anything about God. And I always try to remind my students of that. The evidence for evolution is so abundant, consistent, and convincing. 97% of professional biologists accept that biological evolution is the explanation for common diversity that we see. The evidence I'm sharing this morning barely skims the surface. I spend half a semester on this information. But we're going to start by looking at bacteria to better understand one of the mechanisms of evolution. And so since the theme seems to be we need to have 3 main points, I have 3 chunks of evidence that I'm going to help you with as we talk about evolution. So this video went viral about 6 months ago. Probably many of you have seen it. And it was filmed, and the research was done at the Kashoni lab at Harvard Medical School. And basically the point is to show the origin of new gene variation that shows bacteria becoming resistant to higher and higher concentrations of antibiotics. So
what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right, It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
So if that was too quick and brand new for some of you, there's a posting on the BioLogos website on that where there's a beautiful explanation, a link to the video. Now, I could spend the rest of the talk just talking about this. I get all excited like you do about galaxies. This is so exciting. But I'm not going to. I just want to make sure I clarify one thing. In any one band that we saw with a particular concentration of antibiotic, there's an entire population of many, 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 many descendants from the first or a few initial bacteria. So those bacteria that had a particular mutation to a particular amount of concentration divides, and we get multiple generations in any one band. And then we've accumulated enough or some unique mutations such that then the bacteria can move into the next band at a higher concentration. So evolutionary biologists oftentimes use this tree diagram that you've probably seen. And since I want to use this a little bit later, I want to walk through a tree diagram to represent what we saw on this screen. So I'm going to divide these bands. We've got the blue band, the green band, the orange band, the red band. And what we see is a mutation that occurred after the blue band filled up with its descendants. And we would say that the green band then emerged and that all the bacteria in that green band are resistant to a particular amount of antibiotic. And then we see another mutation occur, and now we get the orange band. And then we see another mutation occur, and the red band fills up. It's important to realize that where you see a mutation on this tree, everything on this particular kind of tree to the right would then have that mutation and then accumulate mutations beyond that. And that's going to come up again a few times. So another really important thing to realize is that any one generation, you see a tiny little blue dot I have there on the edge of the screen. If you look at the descendant of that particular one bacteria, it would look almost identical. We wouldn't be able to tell. It might have minor variations. But when we look over many hundreds or thousands of generations, we see something that looks like a big dramatic change. So it's important to remember that parent or offspring, those descendants, really don't look that different. Okay? I'm also going to use that in a minute either. So a lot of people would say, well, this isn't controversial. What's the big deal? You know, Christians have no problem with this. In fact, we're all very familiar with superbugs in hospitals that are resistant to all the typical antibiotics. So yeah, it's not. What people are resistant to is the idea of life emerging from a common ancestor, which I'm going to call large-scale evolution. We don't often see evolutionary biologists liking the word macroevolution very much. So what I want to look at is a well-documented case study, whale evolution. And I can share a lot of particular evidence with you, but I'm going to be very specific on what I share, and then I can refer you to some books if you'd like later. Scientists have accumulated a lot of corroborating evidence to argue that whales evolved from four-legged wolf-like creature approximately 60 million years ago. And we're going to spend some time looking at the fossil evidence. They also have embryology evidence, which we won't look at. That is a study of embryos and their development in utero. Isotope ratios, which looks at oxygen isotopes and shows a shift over time from freshwater to seawater. And then we are going to look a little bit at the genetics there. So if you aren't too familiar with whales and you haven't studied them in a while, they're not fish. Whales are mammals. So whales are warm-blooded. They breathe air through blowholes, not gills. They give birth to live young and they nurse them. They actually show the beginnings of some hair development when they're in utero. They have the two separate jaws in their, two separate bones in their jaw, all the character traits that mammals have. And this tree shows some of those intermediate species between that wolf-like mammal about 50 million years ago and our modern day whales. What we don't see are all the fossils in between. We don't see the 60 million years worth of fossils. Why? Well, fossils are very difficult to form. It's actually surprising we have very many at all, because fossils require just the right soil type and just the right moisture content, and those conditions are extremely rare. But we absolutely have intermediate species that we see. And it's also important to remember what I tried to explain just a couple minutes ago, is that any individual would look very, very similar to its parent and offspring, but over long periods of time, what are gradual shifts in DNA between generations appear to be major jumps in physiological forms when we collapse it into a diagram like this. So this fossil evidence we have shows some of the changes that we see in modern day whales. So for example, they have spine modifications that allow for more efficient modes of swimming. Fish swim like this. Whales swim like this. It's very interesting. There's some great videos that PBS has on that. We also see nostrils that move toward the top of the skull from being here in the front of the snout. We see movement towards the top of the skull, and we can see that movement in many of the fossils. We also see the shrinking of the hind legs to where they can no longer support the animal on land. So we can find some of the small hind legs in those fossil forms, but they're very tiny. So up to this point, one could argue that this data could be explained by the common design argument. That argument being, well, of course. Why would God make new traits? The traits we have in existing mammals work just fine. Reuse them. So this evidence doesn't actually point to common descent very well. But what's been really inspiring, exciting, is the evidence in the last 10, 20 years in genetics. Modern day genetics has just shown some beautiful stuff. So we're going to move into that. You may not know, but the sense of smell, olfaction is what it's called, is the primary sense in most mammals. And so what we have is we have cells in the nasal cavity. We have receptors and then neurons that take odors in the air and send messages so that animals can hunt, find their way, detect danger, that type of thing. So mammals have about 1,000 of their 22,000 or so genes devoted to detecting odors. Think about that. That's a huge percentage of the genes for sense of smell. Okay? Now what you have here, it says cow, and there's a bunch of letters. So you want to kind of channel your high school biology class if it has been that long since you've had one. But these are nucleotide bases. This is a segment of a gene that's related to our olfactory receptors. And what you have is A's, C's, T's, and G's. There are no letters in your body. These are molecules, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymidine. And we just have them in order like this. And what I'm going to show you is this same gene that we saw in cow, which is the second row. It might be small for you in the back. We see this same gene in many, many, many animals, the mouse, the hippo. But when we look in the whale, it's non-functional. What does that mean? What we see is a deletion. The first little black box you see there shows that, I think that's a thymidine, I have to get a little bit closer, is missing. So when there was copying happening, we got this mutation and that's missing. That can be problematic. We also see, if we scoot down to the second dark box there, is we see C, the letter C, in the ones above changing to the letter A, which means a molecule is a small minor molecular shift. So we have this substitution. And what that means is that the gene can't be read in the same way. And so it's not going to be producing or sending the message or making the protein or whatever that gene's going to do. It's not going to do it appropriately. So we call it non-functional. So that gene is found in other cetaceans, and it's non-functional in exactly the same way. We see it in whales. We see it in bottlenose dolphins, Dahl's porpoises. So let's look at this on a tree. It's a phylogenetic tree. We have mammals on the top. You guys get ignored over here, don't you? We have mammals on the top. We have mice. We have artiodactyls, which are even-toed ungulates. Who cares? Things like hippos, camels, cows. We have baleen whales, dolphins, porpoises, and toothed whales. Those last three are cetaceans. And we have your baleen, and then everything else is called toothed. I'm simplifying it by separating out dolphins and porpoises. So what we see is there's an ancestral species, some sort of mammal, that is the ancestor to all of these. So everything to the right of that ancestral species would have those traits. And then we have another ancestral species and another ancestral species. And so dolphins and porpoises and toothed whales share the traits that ancestral species A had, but the others do not. Okay, so now we want to look at those nucleotide bases, and we want to stick those onto this tree, these non-functional messages. So if you look at the top, I picked a gene, V1. It's a vomeronasal gene, if anybody out there is a biologist and does whale biology. We're going to call it V1RA, and there's a deletion. Okay, so this code of nucleotide bases, these letters have a deletion in them. And so we're going to mark that deletion here. The simplest explanation, if both dolphins and porpoises have that deletion with toothed whales, we're going to put that mark right there on the phylogenetic tree. And then we see another gene, V2RA, I'm calling it. And again, we have another deletion, and it's the three cetaceans. So we're going to put that mark on the tree here. And we have another deletion we see, I'm calling it V3RA, and we're going to put that mark on the tree here. And when we collapse this down, we see a pattern that looks a whole lot to us like representing common ancestry. Why? Because if you have a mutation at V3, everything that comes after that ancestral species, the descendants seem to have that mutation. We see the same thing with V2. We see the same thing for V1. The descendants have that mutation. This suggests common descent. And we don't find mutations and dysfunctional genes that follow this pattern. We don't find something that's in the hippo and the dolphins and porpoises, but not in anybody else. Okay, so this pattern is very, very consistent. So there's quite a bit of evidence to show that whales evolved from to show the evolution of whales. And all this evidence converges to tell us the same exact story. And it's very convincing, these converging lines of evidence. But most importantly, we see the non-functional genes that are almost identical to the functional genes in other mammals. And that points us to common descent and makes the common design argument untenable. Now, I have my third example that I want to give you, but it's a little bit more sensitive and more difficult for people, and it's human evolution. So while I know that there are philosophical and theological and psychological issues why people want to reject human evolution, by ignoring the evidence does not make it inaccurate and does not make it go away. So let's dive in and take a look at some of that evidence. First, we're going to look at a human evolution tree. This tree is not as neat and clean as the others, but what I want you to notice about this hominin tree is that it's very branched and bushy. And just like we saw with antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and just like we saw with the whales, there isn't a moment where we have a genetic mutation and all of a sudden there's dramatic differences. And that's what I want you to gain from looking at this tree, is that there's a lot of small genetic differences that have occurred over long, long periods of time that result in the different hominin fossil forms we see. So there are a huge and abundant amount of increase in the fossil evidence we found over the last 25 years. Again, very exciting for those looking at this. In fact, we have over 6,000 fossil skeletons and remnants of skulls that we're finding that point toward human and hominin evolution. And we see this fossil evidence, showing a few different things. It's showing what you have in this picture on the far left is an image of some evidence of bipedal walking. The foramen magnum ratio, the hole in your skull where your spinal cord comes up. We see that shifting towards the center. A dog would have it towards the back as the dog is bent over, and ours moves towards the center, and we can see that in the fossil evidence. We see greater brain size, which is this image you see on the bottom left. And we also see greater height. But in all of these, what we notice is, again, we could say common design, God made it this way. So I'm going to go back to olfaction and sense of smell. In humans, almost all the otoreceptor genes are still present, but 60% are defective. Now, in mice, in dogs, 80% are functional. We only have less than 40% functional. And we're going to go back to this phylogenetic tree example. We have ancestral species that shows that chimps and humans are most closely related. About 10 million years later, prior to that, we share an ancestral species that includes the gorilla. And then we add on the macaque at central species D about 15 million years ago. And so let's look at otoreceptor gene, position 182. All those little letters, when you have a really, really long string of them, we just number them. And we can talk about where we see dysfunction or things going wrong. Here we see a deletion, if you look at the top row, in position 182, that affects the chimps and humans. We see a stop codon, just a message inside there that makes it stop coding. At point 274, we see a deletion at 270. We see a deletion at 178 that affects all of these. And again, there's just a single one at 77 that affects humans. And again, if we look at that pattern, this suggests to us common descent. When we get a mutation at point D, it affects the orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and humans, and nothing before that. Now, I've provided just a small sampling of the evidence to support evolution and common ancestry. And in my course, I spent about a third of the semester introducing students to this evidence. But many of my students are uncomfortable and resistant to learning about evolution because they've come from churches that have told them they have to reject evolution. And David and Brad and Catherine did a beautiful job of introducing us to some of that. And what I've learned is that I have to help my students reconcile science and faith by addressing their fears and their anxieties first. And I know their fears and anxieties well because I lived them. So I attended a large public university, and when I started in college, I was a Christian. And in one of my first biology classes, the professor told us, you can't believe in God and accept evolution, that evolution proves that there's no God. And I found this really puzzling. And I went to a couple of pastors I knew, and I sought them out and asked them, and they told me the same thing. You have to choose faith or evolution. And my biology classes were showing that evolution was a reality. And since everybody was telling me I had to choose, I made a conscious decision in college to give up my faith, reject all belief in God, and I became an atheist. And it wasn't until a couple of years after I got out of college that I came back to Christ. But then I had to spend the next 10 years trying to make sense of the philosophical and theological issues so that I can then reconcile my Christian faith with my acceptance of evolution. And now it's 20-something years later, and I do everything I can to help change this conflict character of evolution and faith. And my parents look at me, why? Why do you do this? This is hard work. And I do it because I care about people's salvation. I don't want students not going into the sciences because they're told that they have to reject evolution or reject mainstream science. I don't want students leaving their faith because they learn about evolution or they learn about other science things. So I care about these kids. Many of them do leave their faith, unfortunately. The Barna Group conducted a poll, you heard about it a few minutes ago, of young adults with a Christian background. And they found this: 3 out of 10 feel that churches are out of step with the scientific world we live in. A quarter hold the perception that Christianity is anti-science, and just about as many said that they've been turned off by the creation and evolution debate. This is heartbreaking and unnecessary. Okay, pressuring our young people to reject evolution outright leads them into a corner, and they end up with a faith crisis. I just heard about one of these Monday night in my class. It's not even what I'm going to talk about right now. About 3 weeks ago, I was in Oklahoma speaking at a Christian university, and 50 so students in the room, and one came up to me afterward, and he said, "Can we talk over coffee?" He shared with me that he gave up his faith, that his home church and his parents did not want to engage in conversations about the evidence for evolution. And he felt that the conversations he had with them they were closed-minded, and he felt it was dishonest and almost deceptive, and because of that, he gave up his faith. We can do better than this. We need to do better than this. We need to have honest, intellectual, and transparent conversations and engagement with the scientific findings. We owe this to our youth. And it's very possible for us to do that. I view my role in the classroom as a shepherd, guiding students and supporting students in their walk so that as they learn about evolution, their faith can be deepened and their beliefs can be strengthened. And it's very exciting to do that. While I don't have a lot of time to share with you, one of the strategies I've learned is that the students want to be heard. They want an opportunity to share what their beliefs are. They want to ask questions, and what they really don't like is dogmatism. They don't like it when somebody says you have to believe this, when they're coercive, when it's just a closed environment. My students really don't like that. So I start my classes by telling my students, you don't need to accept evolution just because we're learning about it. My only goal is that you understand me, that you understand that a person like me exists, a person that embraces and loves the Lord, reads the Bible, goes to church, and I also accept evolution. And you need to see that as a legitimate Christian position to hold. And then I give them an opportunity to write a conversation. It's in the first week of classes. They're assigned you have to write a conversation between a person who's a believer and a person who's not. And you have to write this whole conversation about the processes of creation. And this gives them an opportunity to tell me their fears, their anxieties, what they think. I read these. I make comments back to them. So I have 70 students. It's a lot of work, but it's totally worth it. Then I devote some time in my class to teaching about evolution. That's hard to do. When you teach a biology class, there is no time. But I still devote some time to it. In order to address some of the philosophical and theological issues, I assign 8 chapters of the Origins books. I love this book, this Harzma book, she doesn't pay me to put this up here, but I love this book for my students. And then I devote an entire hour in my semester, which is just never enough time in a semester to cover this stuff. I devote an entire hour to conversations where the kids just talk and wrestle with difficult questions about what would it mean to accept evolution? What does it mean to my faith? How do I do this? Evolutionary creation is a beautiful, beautiful option for our kids. I was going to read you a little story from Emily, but I don't have time to do that. So using the language that Deb used up here, and I have the same thing here written on my notes, if we can help students view creation through the lens that God was and is the creator, then we can courageously explore what evolution shows us, a set of incredibly complex, intricate, and elegant mechanisms for creating biological diversity. And many of my students do see evolution this way. So there's a lot of hope.